Good to have you here. Get comfortable, however that looks for you right now. Let your body find where it wants to be. Your shoulders, your hands, your breath. There's nothing you need to hold on to tonight. You don't have to follow every part of the story. Just let it come in. Let it drift when it does. That's enough. I'm always curious about this. Where in the world are you listening from right now? What time is it there? Leave it below if you feel like it. I genuinely love reading those. And if this is the kind of quiet you'd like more of, a like helps others find it, and a subscribe means I'll be here the next time you need this. No rush. Let's begin. The darkness before a Roman dawn was not empty. It held the weight of everything the day had not yet demanded. The slow exhale of stone walls cooling, the particular stillness of 60 people breathing in rooms stacked one above another. Unconscious and unknowing, history didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. 47 BC, the Palatine Hill, Rome. The smell of charcoal ash in the brazier, the faint particular sweetness of last night's fire, not yet cold. She rose before the first cock crowed on the street below. Before the water carriers began their slow procession up the hill. Before her husband stirred in the room beyond the curtain. This was not an act of duty. It was an act of possession. The house was hers in the hour before it became everyone else's. The atrium received her first. The impluvium pool had taken the night cold, and when she passed close, the air above the water touched her forearms. The kind of cold that settles into bone like it intends to stay. She stood at its edge and looked up at the compluvium opening, still dark, the earliest gray only hinting at its corners. A drop of water sounded like the room was counting seconds. She heard it fall, and heard the room return to silence. She was 38, 19 years in this house. She knew its every sound. From the atrium, she moved to the tablinum, the office, her husband's formal space, though she had organized its contents since the first year of their marriage and had reorganized it 3 times since. The wax tablets from the previous evening's correspondence were stacked where she had placed them. She did not read them again. She had already read them twice, standing behind her husband while he dictated, understanding before he had finished speaking what each reply would need to contain, what tone, what omission, what carefully placed absence of information. Omission was a language she had studied longer than Greek. She moved through to the coulina, the kitchen, where the head cook was already at work, a small clay lamp throwing orange light across the stone work table. The cook acknowledged her without words, the way people acknowledge those whose authority does not require declaration. She checked the morning supplies, the oil levels in their amphorae, the state of the grain stores against the account in her memory. The fresh herbs cut and bundled and laid out for the morning salutatio's refreshments. Not food exactly, small things, figs and watered wine, and a particular honey cake the clients expected because she had served it at every morning reception for 11 years. Expectation was a form of management. She had learned that before she learned anything else about running a household of this size. Running, the word did not capture it. A household of 60 slaves, 3 personal attendants, 2 secretaries, a steward who reported to her daily, a cook who had served this family longer than she had. This was not running. This was the continuous negotiation of a small city, conducted without title, without record, without acknowledgement in any document that survived. She pressed her thumb against the edge of one of the honey cakes. Still fresh, good. She moved back through the corridor, past the small shrine to the household gods, the lararium. Offerings from the previous evening still in place. The incense stick had burned to nothing. Its smell was still faintly present in the cool air, layered beneath the olive oil from the lamp and the morning cold coming down from the compluvium. 3 different smells occupying the same inch of darkness. She paused and straightened the small figurine that had shifted in the night. Perhaps a vibration from the street, perhaps nothing, perhaps the ordinary restlessness of objects. And she said the household prayer, not loudly but completely, every word, as she had every morning she could remember, not for the gods, or not only for the gods, for the house itself. Then she returned to the atrium and sat in the chair placed just to the left of the entrance. Her chair, not by formal designation, but by 19 years of consistent presence. And she spread her hands flat on her knees. And she thought through the morning. She thought through who would come to the salutatio, and in what order, and what each of them wanted, and what she would give them, and what she would withhold. She thought through the afternoon's accounts. She thought through the evening's dinner, the guests, the seating. She thought through one thing no tablet recorded, one conversation no secretary witnessed. She had not yet told her husband what she intended to recommend to him. She would. By the time the house woke, she would know exactly how. The people who ran this were not the people history recorded running it. Rome in the late Republic produced historians in abundance. It produced orators and senators and military commanders whose speeches were transcribed, whose correspondence was preserved, whose names attached themselves to the years in which they served as consuls. So that time itself became a record of male succession, the year of this man, the year of that man, a calendar made of names, and the names all belonging to one kind of person, one sex, one role, one visible surface of a structure that had always run deeper than its surface. What the record obscures is not a secret so much as an assumption, the assumption that the visible machinery was the real machinery. The men in the Senate spoke and voted, and were seen to speak and vote. The men in the Forum argued cases, made alliances, broke alliances, stood on rostra and threw their voices across crowds. The men sent letters that were kept. The men met in spaces that had names, and so the record became a record of men in named spaces, which is not the same thing as a record of power. Power does not require a named space. Power requires information and the capacity to act on it. The domina of a senior senator's household had both. She had information because the structure of Roman social life funneled it to her. The morning salutatio. Clients came seeking patronage and came first through her presence before they reached her husband's. The visits to other matronae, conducted through a network of social obligations so dense and so regular that information traveled through it faster than most official channels. And the religious ceremonies entirely closed to men, the bona dia rites, the women's observances, where the Roman elite gathered without male presence and spoke without male auditors. Information moved in these spaces. It moved accurately, because the women exchanging it had every reason to exchange it accurately. Their interests depended on knowing things correctly. She understood accounts. Her education, conducted in private by a Greek tutor her father had engaged when she was 7, had covered philosophy and rhetoric and mathematics with equal rigor. Her father, a man of the equestrian class, with ambitions that exceeded his rank, had reasoned, correctly, that a daughter capable of managing the finances of a large household would be more valuable in marriage than one who could only weave. She had learned to manage figures as she managed language, as a tool deployed with precision. The household finances passed through her entirely. The steward kept the records. She reviewed them weekly and had, on 3 occasions, identified discrepancies before the steward had. On all 3 occasions, she had dealt with the discrepancy herself without mentioning it to her husband, because involving her husband would have required a scene. And the scene would have disrupted the household's function. And the disruption was the problem, not the numbers. Managing without disruption. The discipline that left no evidence. Evidence is what happens when something goes wrong. She left very little evidence. The concept of mos maiorum, the ancestral custom, the weight of how things had always been done, was a conservative force in Rome. A brake on innovation, a pressure toward precedent. but it functioned differently inside a household. There, the senior matron's authority under mos maiorum was not a brake. It was a lever. The custom said that she managed the household. The custom said her decisions in the domestic sphere were final. And the domestic sphere, in a senator's house, included everything that a senator needed to function. His schedule, his clients, his food, his clothing, his social obligations, his supply chain, his correspondence infrastructure, the loyalty of 60 people who made his daily existence possible. She held all of this. She held it with the same grip she used on the household accounts. Firm, quiet, invisible to anyone not looking for it. Her husband was not a bad man. He was an intelligent man who understood, in the way that intelligent men of his class and time understood such things, that his household ran well because of his wife, and that his household running well was important to his political position, and that therefore his wife was important to his political position. He had never articulated this. He did not need to articulate it. The understanding moved between them in the way that old understandings move, beneath language, below the level of declaration. She did not resent the invisibility. Resentment was an expenditure she could not afford. She noted it the way one notes a fact about the terrain, useful, relevant, simply accurate. The people who ran this were not the people history recorded running it. The first client had mentioned a name. She had not yet decided what to do with it. The first client arrived before the light was fully established. That particular quality of early Roman morning light that came through the compluvium as gray before it became white. When the atrium existed briefly in two kinds of illumination at once, the oil lamps orange and the skies first gray competing across the same stone floor, she was already seated. This was not accidental. The positioning of the domina of a senior senator's household at the morning salutatio was one of those arrangements that looked like custom and functioned like strategy. She sat to the left of the formal reception area, in the chair that was hers by practice rather than protocol. And she received the clients before her husband joined them, not as a formal act of delegation, but as the natural first point of contact in a house where she was always already present when others arrived. The first client was a man she recognized, a grain merchant, not wealthy, who had been seeking a contract with the state purchasing apparatus for 3 seasons. He smelled of the street, that particular early morning Rome smell of wet stone and torch smoke and the accumulated presence of too many people in too little space. The city's exhale still clinging to his wool cloak. He bowed his head in her direction, which was more acknowledgement than many offered, and then he waited. She asked him 2 questions, not the questions he expected, not the formal questions about the contract, the petition, the path through the correct offices. She asked him who else he had spoken to, and she asked him what he had heard about the grain situation in the eastern provinces. His answers told her 3 things: that he was better connected than his presentation suggested, that the information he carried was more current than anything she had received through her own correspondence in the previous week, and that he was frightened, not of failure, of a specific person whose name he mentioned once and then did not repeat. She noted all 3 things. She noted them in her memory, which was the only record she kept, because the only record she kept was the only record no one else could read. He left when her husband arrived. The second client was a young man, the son of an old political ally, sent by his father with a message and also, beneath the message, with a purpose. His father wanted to know if the family's recent difficulties had affected the senator's willingness to maintain the alliance. She read this beneath the young man's careful words, the way she read subtext in a letter, attending to what was present at the edges of what was actually said. She answered the young man in a way that addressed both the message and the purpose. That gave the father his reassurance without naming the reassurance, so that no one who overheard the exchange could have identified what had been communicated. The young man left looking less tense than he had arrived. Her husband glanced at her from across the atrium. She did not return the glance. They had conducted this exchange, the quick flicker of his eyes, her stillness 1,000 times. He had noticed. He would not ask. Through the next hour, she received 4 more clients. 2 were genuinely useful. 2 were performing usefulness without content. She provided the honey cakes and the watered wine. She listened to a complicated grievance about a building contract dispute that had nothing to do with her husband's sphere, and everything to do with a mutual acquaintance she could speak to at next week's women's ceremony. And she identified, in the careful silence of a man who came and stood and barely spoke, that he was carrying a message he did not intend to deliver to her husband at all. That he had come to determine whether the household was stable before he committed anything. She made 3 calm statements in his presence about the household's plans, the senator's health, the family's social engagements for the next month, and watched the tension in his shoulders release fractionally. He would be back with the real message. She watched him go and felt something specific, the satisfaction of information correctly handled. A soldier knows this feeling after a well-placed watch, a craftsman after a joint that holds. She knew it the way a person who has always worked at this level knows it. Not as triumph or pride, but as simple rightness. The assessment was accurate. The instrument calibrated. The last lamp in the atrium went out as the morning light made it unnecessary, something she had learned young. The people who came to the morning door did not come for what they said. Behind every request was a question. Behind every question was a fear. Read the fear first. Everything else followed. The household accounts were kept in 2 places. In the records the steward maintained on wax tablets, organized by category and month, and in her memory, where she kept a running parallel record that the steward did not know existed, and her husband had never thought to ask about. The discrepancy between the 2 records was rarely large. What it was, always, was informative. She had learned to manage a household of this size the way one learns to manage a language, first by imitation, then by rule, then, and this was the stage that made the difference, by the point at which rule becomes instinct, and instinct becomes judgment that moves faster than conscious thought. She had reached that point some years ago. Now the accounts moved through her attention the way landscape moves through the attention of a traveler who has made the same journey many times, not monotonously, but with the particular alertness of familiarity. The way familiar terrain reveals anomaly precisely because it is familiar. This morning's anomaly was small, 2 amphorae of olive oil, recorded as received that she had not seen arrive. Not missing, simply recorded before they had come. Which meant either that the steward had made a clerical error, possible, he was reliable but not infallible, or that someone had anticipated a delivery and recorded it early, which could mean carelessness, or could mean something she would need to look at more carefully. She did not raise this with the steward immediately. She noted it, moved it to the part of her memory she reserved for things requiring patience, and continued through the day's work. The management of 60 enslaved people was the administrative fact that sat at the center of her household's operation, and was also the fact that sat most heavily in the part of her that had studied philosophy. She had read Stoic arguments about the nature of persons. She had read them in Greek, the language her father's tutor had taught her, alongside rhetoric and mathematics, and she had read them carefully enough to understand what they implied, and carefully enough to understand that the society in which she lived was not structured around their implications. She moved in the reality she had been given. This did not mean the reality was invisible to her. What she had understood early was that the management of people required something different from the management of accounts. Not less precision, but a different kind of precision. She knew the names and circumstances of all 60. She knew the 3 who had been separated from family members when they came to the household. And she knew this not because it was administratively useful, though it was, but because it was the kind of knowledge that cost nothing to hold and bought a great deal in return. She knew who among the house slaves was skilled at what, which skills were being wasted in their current assignments, which reassignment would improve both efficiency and, the word she used was equilibrium. In this house, the language available was Roman, and the concepts available were Roman, and she moved within them as one moves within any given grammar, fluently without needing to endorse every rule. The morning's practical work covered the supplies assessment, 2 disputes amongst the household staff that had arrived at her attention through the steward and required resolution before they became larger. A review of the week's market purchases against the planned household expenses, and the organization of the afternoon's correspondence. The disputes both resolved through the same mechanism. She listened to each party separately, found the actual disagreement beneath the stated one. They were almost never the same, and addressed the actual disagreement quietly without naming it, in a way that allowed both parties to accept the resolution without losing face. Face was important in any small society. Lose too many people's face at once, and the social fabric of the household became difficult to manage. Keep everyone in the position of having been heard, even when the outcome did not favor them entirely, and the fabric held. Her back ached by the middle of the morning. Not from age. She did not think of herself as old. Though 38 in this city, in this class, in this body that had lost 2 children before they breathed, was something. It was from standing too long on cold stone, the particular low ache that moved through the muscles on either side of her spine when the morning chill had done its work. She pressed one hand flat against the small of her back, felt the familiar shape of the discomfort, noted it, and continued. The body, too, was a household, also requiring management, also keeping accounts. She thought, briefly and without sentiment, about the 2 amphorae. By evening she would know whether the discrepancy was clerical. The real decisions were made in a room no one thought to name. In Rome, the dining room had a name, the triclinium. The name described the furniture. 3 couches arranged around the low table, the layout formal enough to have generated architectural vocabulary, to have required its own word. This was the Roman habit. Name the furniture, name the room after the furniture, attend to the arrangement of the visible, and in attending to the visible, miss everything the visible was for. The triclinium was not where decisions were made. It was where decisions were performed, where the outcome of prior conversations was displayed as consensus, as casual agreement, as the natural drift of opinions among men of similar station, eating similar food from the same source. Agreement at the Roman dinner table did not emerge at the Roman dinner table. It arrived there already formed. From the rooms before the table, the corridors before the rooms, the hours before the evening. The hands that had arranged the seating, the mind that had arranged the guests. She arranged both. The dinner that evening had 7 guests, her husband, 3 men connected to the business, currently occupying the Senate's attention, and 3 others whose connection was not to the business, but to the men connected to it. Men whose presence would reframe the conversation, introduce a different set of loyalties into the room, make certain outcomes seem more natural than they would have seemed in a gathering composed only of direct interests. She had selected all 7. Her husband had invited them. The distinction was invisible in the record. It was visible to her. The seating she had determined 3 days earlier and adjusted yesterday. A letter had arrived through her correspondence from a friend whose husband sat on a different committee containing a passage about a particular debt held by one of the evening's guests. The debt changed which of the 2 men he would most easily be drawn toward if they were seated in proximity. She had moved him accordingly.
A matter of 2 feet of couch space.
She did not recline at the table. Roman custom placed the matron of the house in the room, but not in the full reclining dining position of the male guests. She might sit in a chair, or she might move freely. Present, but not occupying the same ritual space as the men consuming her household's food and drinking her household's wine. This was understood as a form of lesser inclusion. She understood it as a form of greater freedom. She was not fixed. She could move. Moving allowed her to observe without appearing to observe. To speak to each guest separately at some point in the evening. To gather what each of them carried into the room that they had not yet deposited into the general conversation. What she gathered was this. The third guest on the right-hand couch had been to the port that morning. For reasons unrelated to the Senate business, but which had had proximity to a conversation she had been trying to locate for 2 weeks through other channels. She registered this without expression. She filed it behind her eyes in the particular internal cabinet where she kept information that was not yet ready to be used. She spoke 4 times during the dinner, each time for fewer than 10 words. Each of the 4 statements was positioned at a specific point in the conversation. After a pause, before a shift in subject, in the way that a single precise word, positioned correctly in a piece of rhetoric, can change the direction of an argument without appearing to have entered it. She had studied rhetoric. The men in the room had studied rhetoric. The difference was that she was not supposed to have it, and those who were not supposed to have it learned to use it without appearing to. She poured wine, at one point unnecessary. The slaves were efficient, and in doing so moved to the far end of the table, and heard, in the silence that falls briefly. When a hostess moves into a conversation space, the half-sentence that told her what she needed to know about the actual purpose of the evening's agreement. She carried the wine jug back to the serving table. She set it down. The stone of the table was cold under her fingertips. The smell of the evening's food, roasted meat, cumin, the particular sweetness of honeyed wine, sat thick in the warm air. The lamps threw long shadows across the ceiling. One of the men laughed at something. The sound was large and satisfied. She thought, yes, this is going the way it needs to go. The real decisions were made in a room no one thought to name. The person there left no record that said so. The afternoon existed in 2 registers. The visible one, which included a visit to the house of Phoibe, the wife of a man who served alongside her husband on the committee reviewing grain distribution contracts, and the invisible one, which was the reason for the visit. She had dressed for both registers. The wool of her stola was good but not ostentatious. The particular Roman calculation of dress that communicated status without appearing to pursue status. A balance she had refined over years to the precise weight of a compliment that invites confidence rather than envy. Rose water on her wrists, the oil of it faint and present in the cold afternoon air. Her hair arranged in the current style. Not because she cared about the style, but because arriving in an outdated style communicated something she did not want to communicate. That the household's attention was elsewhere, that things were not as managed as they appeared. Everything communicated. She had understood this as a child. She had spent 38 years learning to compose the communication accurately. Fulvia's house was on the slope of the same hill, but lower, a position that communicated its own information about the family standing. A fact Fulvia managed with the same calibrated composure she managed everything else. They were not close in the way that implied ease. They were close in the way that implied mutual recognition. 2 women of similar intelligence operating in similar constraints, for whom candor was possible precisely because neither had anything to gain from deception of the other. They drank watered wine and discussed the children first. This was protocol, not sentiment. The children's information was important. It located each family in the social calendar for the next month, told each woman where the other's attention was likely to be concentrated, identified possible alignments and possible conflicts in the near future. Her daughter was 14 and beginning the serious phase of her education, reading Plato in Greek. practicing the controlled argumentation of debate in a household where such things were permitted, because her mother had made certain the household was one where such things were permitted. Her daughter, a fact she had decided when the girl was 2 years old. She would not be unarmed. The world would not provide her the weapons, the public role, the formal education, the named position. But this house would make sure she had the skills in her hands before it sent her out into the world that would require her to use them in secret. Fulvia listened to this report with the expression she wore when she was also calculating. Her own daughter was 12. Then the conversation moved, as it always eventually moved, to the information both women had gathered since they last met. Not scandal. Scandal was for women who had nothing better to use their networks for. What they exchanged was structural. Which alliances were shifting and why, where the pressure in the current political arrangement was actually located, versus where it appeared to be located, which men in the Senate were acting out of conviction, and which out of fear. The distinction between conviction and fear was one she had learned to identify quickly and reliably. A man acting from conviction was predictable. A man acting from fear was volatile. Volatile was dangerous. Dangerous required management of a different kind. She returned to her house in the late afternoon, carrying in her memory 6 new pieces of information and having dispensed 2 in return. Both pieces she could afford to release. Both useful to Fulvia, neither capable of causing difficulty if they traveled further through the network. At home she wrote 3 letters. The letters were composed in the studied, elegant Latin she had been taught and had refined over years of practice, a Latin that achieved its effects through what it did not say, as much as through what it said. She sealed them with her own seal, the same seal her mother had used, an image of a single olive branch pressed into warm wax. Beside the letters she sat with her daughter for 1 hour. Her daughter was reading Plato's Republic in the original. She listened to the girl read a passage aloud, corrected 1 word, and then asked the girl not what the passage meant, but what was wrong with the argument. The girl thought for a moment. Then she answered. The answer was partially correct. She had found 1 problem and missed a second. Her mother showed her the second. The girl's face, receiving it, the quick flicker of embarrassment followed by the longer, calmer expression of understanding, did not look exactly like satisfaction. It looked like the thing before satisfaction, the recognition. The moment where knowing becomes a permanent addition to the self. Her mother watched that moment arrive in her daughter's face. She had put it there. Her husband returned to the house in the early evening, as the lamps were being lit throughout the rooms, and the household moved into the particular rhythm of the dinner hours, the contained busyness of the kitchen, the careful organization of the triclinium space, the low sounds of preparation that ran beneath the quiet like a current beneath still water. He was tired. She knew his tired the way she knew the particular cracks in the atrium stone. Not because she cataloged them deliberately, but because 19 years of daily attention had made them part of her interior geography. This tiredness was not the tiredness of physical labor. It was the tiredness of a man who had spent the day performing his position and had found the performance more demanding than usual. The lines around his mouth were set differently. His hands, when he set down the scroll he carried, settled on the table with more weight than usual. When the body can no longer distinguish heavy from heavier, she gave him wine and waited. The first few minutes of his evening return were not for information. She had learned this early in the marriage and relearned it several times in the years since. A man who had been performing all day needed a transitional space between the performance and the conversation. A few minutes in which nothing was required of him. She had given him this consistently for 19 years, not because it was a domestic virtue, but because a man who had not been given the transitional space came to the conversation less openly, with his defenses still half raised, which made the conversation less accurate and therefore less useful. She wanted accurate conversations. Accuracy required preparation. When he began to speak about the day, the committee's work, the man who had made the afternoon difficult, she listened with the quality of attention she had always brought to things that mattered. A quality of stillness, a capacity to be entirely present to another person's words without inserting herself into them, without anticipating and thereby distorting. She heard everything he said. She heard, more importantly, what the arrangement of what he said told her, which elements he returned to, which he passed over quickly, which made his voice change in the way that voices change when the speaker is moving around something rather than through it. He was moving around the vote tomorrow. She waited until he had completed what he chose to say. Then she spoke. Not long. She had never needed length. She said. She had heard through the afternoon's correspondence that the third commitment on the right side of the committee was less firm than it appeared. She said this not as information he should act on immediately, but as information he should carry into the evening with him. To sleep beside, to consider before the morning's decisions, he looked at her. He asked how she knew. She said she had heard it. He accepted this. He had accepted it many times over 19 years. He did not ask for the chain of evidence, for the letter from Fulvia's household that had carried a fragment of an observation, that had connected to a previous fragment from a different correspondence, that had assembled itself, in her mind, into the conclusion she had just handed him. He accepted the conclusion the way one accepts the deliverable without requiring visibility into the process. She was the process. He trusted the deliverable. This trust, earned and maintained with the same consistency she brought to the household accounts, was the most important asset she managed. Not trust as warmth, not trust as affection. Trust as the continuous accumulation of accurate information delivered at the right time and used well. A record of performance so long it no longer required justification. She refilled his wine. She told him about the eating adjustment for the evening's dinner. She told him about the guest who had been to the port that morning and what that meant for the conversation he was about to have. She told him 2 things to listen for and 1 thing to say in response to a predictable moment that would come in the 3rd hour of dinner. He repeated them back to her, not writing them down, because this was not the kind of conversation that could be written down. She left him to prepare for the dinner. In the corridor, she stopped. She pressed one hand against the wall. The plaster was cold under her palm, the particular cold of stone that has not been close to a flame. The cold of a surface that holds its temperature from the foundation up, indifferent to the warmth moving through the rooms it separates. She held her palm there. Then she continued. Tomorrow there would be more. First the evening had to hold. The house reached its silence in stages. The dinner guests departed in the 2nd hour after dark, their voices audible first and then diminishing. The particular diminishment of voices moving down a hill in cold air. The way sound travels differently once the body producing it has turned away and begun to move in another direction. Then, the household's clearing work. The systematic disassembly of the evening. The removal of lamps from positions they had occupied only for guests. The restoration of the tablinum to its daily order. The accounting of the plates. The last instructions to the cook about the morning stores. This work moved through the house like a tide going out, until the last lamp in the public rooms was extinguished, and only the corridor lights remained, small and steady, orange against the dark stone. She moved through the house one final time. This was not the same movement as the pre-dawn passage. That passage was forward-looking, a preparation for the day opening. This one was different. This was the check of a person who is responsible for something in the deep sense of the word. Not responsible as in accountable to others, but responsible as in carrying. As in, if this breaks, it breaks under her watch, and she knows it, and she has never once put that knowledge down. The atrium was empty, the impluvium pool darker than the dark above it. She stood beside it for a moment. The charcoal smell from the evening's braziers hung in the air, mixed with the last trace of the dinner. Cumin, wine warmth, the residual presence of 7 people who had eaten and drunk and talked, and departed with things she had given them that they had not known were given. The cold coming down from the compluvium was absolute now, the kind that settles into bone like it intends to stay, and she stood in it without hurrying away. She thought about the vote tomorrow. She had done what she could with what she had. The information delivered to her husband. The seating managed. The conversation at the dinner moved through its points in the way she had prepared it to move. Whether it held depended now on things she could not control, on the volatility of a frightened man, on the stubbornness of a committed one, on the degree to which the third commitment had already moved further than her intelligence had been able to determine. She had pushed her knowledge to its edges and acted at its edge. This was the only honest position. Nothing further was available. The philosopher in her had read Aristotle and Plato and Groic, and discussed them with no one but her own silent interior. She understood that this was the permanent condition of action, always conducted at the edge of knowledge. Certainty is only granted in retrospect. Retrospect is the luxury of those who have finished, not the position of those who continue. She had always continued. She thought about her daughter reading Plato, about the second problem in the argument, the one her daughter had missed and then found. The girl would find problems like that for the rest of her life. Find them in texts, in rooms, in the space between what people said and what they meant. Find them in silence, the way a person learns to read a room by what it does not offer, the way her mother had found them, without anyone naming the skill. 60 people slept in this house, 60 people who would wake tomorrow and move through their assigned work in the world her husband's name made possible, and her management made real. Her daughter would sleep. Growing another day closer to the marriage, her mother was already quietly considering, already beginning to arrange with the same careful attention to information and positioning and timing that she brought to everything else. She managed. 3 political careers had bent in directions they would not have bent without the conversations that passed through this atrium, this triclinium, these hands. The record would name the men. The record would name the votes, the speeches. The record would construct its history from the visible machinery. The atrium pool was perfectly still. The house was silent enough that she could hear her own breathing. Unrecorded, unrecordable, existing only in this moment. Power that leaves no record is still power. Presence that survives in no chronicle is still presence. Work that holds no name is still work. Done, continuous, real. She extinguished the last lamp. The smell of the spent wick, thin and acrid, the taste of something that has been asleep, bitter earth, was the last sensory fact of the evening. The house breathed around her. The dark held everything she had done that day, and everything the morning would ask. The history they recorded was the history of commands given, not the history of hands that obeyed them. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. 50 BC, Rome, the smell of charcoal beginning to catch. She was already awake before the charcoal made its sound. The darkness in the culina was different from the darkness above it. Deeper, heavier, the kind of darkness that holds heat from the previous day and gives it back slowly, like something owed. Phoibe rose from the mat without making a sound. This was not an accident. She had learned the acoustics of the passage, the particular creak of the third stone near the wall, the way sound carried upward through the house when the night was still. She had learned these things the way the body learns them, not by being told, but by being corrected, once years ago, and never needing correction again. She was 26 years old. She had worked in this culina since she was 10. She had buried 2 men above her in rank, both of them called archimagirus, both of them older, both of them weaker than she had been told men were supposed to be. She had never been given their title. She had been given their labor. The charcoal was her first task. She moved to the hearth by memory, not by sight. Her fingers found the edge of the firebox, found the small pile of coals banked from the evening before, found the iron rod she used to open them. She had done this in darkness so many times that her hands had a separate knowledge from her mind, the knowledge of the body that accumulates not in thought but in repetition, until repetition becomes something closer to instinct. The coals opened, a small orange eye in the blackness. She fed it slowly, charcoal, then breath, low, steady from beneath, the way the coals wanted it, not a rush of air but a patience. The fire required patience. The fire always required patience. She had given it patience for 16 years, and the fire had always answered. The first light that morning was not the sun. It was fire. It was always fire. She knew without being told what the day required. The household would wake in layers. First the other kitchen slaves, then the door slaves, then the household steward, then the family's body slaves, then the family. Each layer had its appetite and its hour. By the time the first layer woke, she needed the water heated. By the time the family's body slaves descended, she needed the bread shaped and the first preparations of the morning meal underway. She had not been given this schedule. She had deduced it. She had memorized it. She had improved it quietly over years, finding the small efficiencies that compounded into extra minutes. Minutes she had learned to spend on preparation rather than urgency. There was a word she had been taught in childhood, in a language she was no longer permitted to speak. It meant something between readiness and care. Her mother had used it to describe the way you felt when you loved something and prepared for it. She had not spoken the word aloud in many years. She thought it sometimes, alone in the dark, while the fire built. The cold was still in the stones of the floor. Her feet knew it. The culina sat below and apart from the main house, connected by a covered passage, and the earth that held it gave up its cold in the mornings the same way it gave up nothing else. Slowly, reluctantly, with effort, she added a second load of charcoal, checked the water vessels, ran her thumb along the edge of a knife she had sharpened the night before, in the last hour when the household was settling. The knife was sharp. It was always sharp. This was not a small thing. She had learned that the difference between a sharp knife and a dull one was time, not seconds, but entire stretches of a day's rhythm. She kept her tools the way she kept the fire, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that the tool would only give back what she had already given it. The charcoal was fully caught now. The culina was beginning its second kind of darkness. Not the absence of light, but the presence of fire shadow, the deep orange flicker that made every surface look older than it was. She stood for a moment. One moment before the day arrived. She knew what was coming, as she always knew. The knowing was its own exhaustion, a weight that rested not in the muscles, but somewhere behind the eyes. She closed them briefly, drew a breath. Then she began. No chronicle named the person who made this possible. That was not an accident. In the city of Rome in the 1st century, before the Common Era, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all inhabitants were enslaved. This was not a marginal condition. It was the architecture of the civilization. The roads, the grain, the armies, the meals of the wealthy. All of it rested on a foundation that was not metaphorical but literal. Human bodies owned as property, classified under Roman law alongside livestock and furniture, bought and sold with the same instruments used to transfer land. The numbers resist easy comprehension. Estimates place the enslaved population of Rome at 400,000 to 500,000 at any given time in the late Republic. The Italian peninsula held perhaps 2 to 3 million enslaved people. There had been slave revolts, 3 major ones in the preceding century, the last led by Spartacus, ending in the crucifixion of thousands along the road from Capua to Rome. The crosses had stood until they rotted. The revolts failed. The institution continued. Within the institution, there were hierarchies. Roman slavery was not monolithic. A secretary enslaved to a senator moved through corridors of power and wrote documents that outlasted both of them. A scholar enslaved in a wealthy household taught the household's children literature and philosophy. An educated Greek origin slave, literate, trained, fluent in Latin and in the domestic systems of a large household, occupied a different world from the enslaved laborer in a silver mine who would be dead within 3 years. The difference between these worlds mattered. It mattered enormously to the people living them, and yet the legal status was identical. The right to be beaten was identical. The right to be sold was identical. The family could be broken apart the same way. Regardless of whether the slave in question had just written a letter in 3 languages or had just reduced a sauce from Bithynian pepper and Syrian wine. Kitchen work held a particular position in this hierarchy. The archimagirus, the head cook, was a figure of genuine status in a large Roman household. Roman cooking was elaborate, demanding, and laden with social meaning. A meal prepared poorly was an embarrassment. A meal prepared with skill was evidence of the household's refinement, its wealth, its access to spices from the far edges of empire. The cook who produced that meal was a craftsperson of high value, and the cook was, in almost every instance, enslaved. Manumission, the formal granting of freedom, was a feature of Roman slavery that distinguished it, in certain ways, from other ancient systems. Slaves could be freed by their owners. Some were in old age, as a gesture. Some bought their freedom with money, saved from small transactions permitted by tolerant owners. Some were freed in wills. Kitchen slaves were freed rarely. The logic was simple. A slave who had spent 15 years mastering the coulina, who knew the household's preferences, who could produce a dinner for 40 with no visible effort, who held in her body the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 preparations. That slave was too useful to release. Usefulness was its own trap. The slave hierarchy in a large domus was intricate and real. The household steward held authority over most of the domestic slaves. Body slaves to the master or mistress occupied positions of proximity to power. Educated slaves with specialized skills existed in a separate category. Secretaries, tutors, physicians. Below them came the skilled tradespeople, craftsmen, weavers, cooks, and below all of them were the kitchen assistants, the water carriers, the fire tenders. Phoibe held none of the titled positions. She held the work. She had been purchased or born, the record is silent, into this household at a time when Roman slave markets received tens of thousands of people each year. Many of them the product of Rome's wars. Many of them Greek origin, educated, cultured, reduced by the mathematics of military conquest to the same legal category as the ox. The record does not name her. No record named her. No record named the 17 others who worked the coulina of a prosperous Roman domus. The record named the master. The record named the steward sometimes. The record noted expenditures on spices, on wine, on Campanian grain. It noted what things cost. It did not note what people cost in human terms. The coulina produced the meals that sustained the household. The household produced the business, the reputation, the political connections, the wealth that allowed the city to function as it was. Remove the coulina, and the household failed. Remove the household, and the network failed. The network was Rome. All of it rested on the hands of people whose names the chronicle did not keep. No chronicle named the person who made this possible. That was not an accident. Invisibility was the system working as designed. The first task after fire was water. She moved to the storage vessels without looking at them. Her hands found the handles the way hands find things they have carried 10,000 times, not by searching, but by returning. The amphorae were of varying sizes, arranged against the east wall in the order she had established herself, over the objection of no one, because no one above her had thought to care about the arrangement of water vessels. The arrangement saved her perhaps 30 steps a day. Over a year, that became miles. She filled the heating vessel over the fire. She filled the mixing basins at the work table. She checked the shallow basin used for washing hands. The slaves would need it when they arrived, and she needed it now. She wiped her hands on the rough cloth tucked at her waist. Already smelling faintly of yesterday's fat and pepper, and the particular sourness of garum that never entirely left any surface in the coolina. The smell of garum. This was the smell she had learned first, at 10 years old, when she had been set to straining it through cloth. The sharp fermented reek of fish sauce that had been pressing and liquefying for months. The smell so dense it lived in the back of the throat. She had been sick the first day. By the third day, she had stopped noticing it. By the end of the first year, it was simply the smell of the kitchen, as unremarkable as smoke. The body adapted to everything. This was its gift. This was also its cost. She began the bread. The dough had been set the evening before. She had done it herself, the last thing before the household slept, because the morning bread required it. She uncovered the bowl, pressed her knuckles into the risen dough, and began to fold and shape. The dough was warm. It had life in it, the specific aliveness of fermentation, the slow breathing of the grain, and the added starter she kept in a small clay pot near the warmest part of the hearth. She had maintained this starter for 9 years. It had outlasted 2 head cooks and 1 plague season when half the household fell to fever. She had fed it every day during the plague season, when there was nothing much to cook, because it seemed to her then that the small act of keeping something alive was worth doing. She shaped the loaves by feel. The weight was right. The surface resisted the right amount. She set them near the fire to prove once more, while she turned to the next preparation. Today's morning meal was straightforward. Olives, which only needed to be dressed. Boiled eggs, which were already done from yesterday's embers. Grain porridge with garum. And a little fat rendered from the pork she had prepared 3 days prior. The porridge required attention. It required standing at the fire and stirring, slowly, with the long wooden paddle, watching the grain thicken and breathe. She stood at the fire and stirred. The heat came off the charcoal in waves that she no longer registered as discomfort. Her left forearm carried the marks of that heat in small faded lines. Old burns, years of reaching across flame, the price of speed. She had learned to work with a kind of spatial knowledge of the fire's reach. She knew exactly how far she could extend her arm into the heat before the skin became a cost she could not afford. This knowledge was precise. It had been learned precisely through error, and then kept precisely through practice. No one had taught her the geometry of the fire. The fire had taught her. The paddle moved in slow circles. The grain thickened. The smell changed from raw earth to cooked earth to something softer, gentler. The particular warmth of grain releasing its starch into the fat. She thought, while she stirred, of the meal she would produce that evening. There was a guest expected. The steward had mentioned it 2 days ago, in the offhand way that meant she was expected to remember and respond without further instruction. The guest was of some significance. The meal would need to be significant. She was already building it, not in words, but in the way she always built a meal. In sequences, in timings, in the backwards calculation of when each thing needed to begin in order to arrive together at the moment of service. Her mind moved through the preparation the way a weaver moves through a pattern, not thinking about it, but being it. The bread was ready. She moved it to the oven with the paddle, heard the particular low sound it made, settling into heat. A simple human satisfaction, momentary, entire. The bread was good. Then her mind returned to the evening and the work that remained. The midday meal was a performance no one watched her rehearse. By the time the household above her was beginning to stir, she had been working for 4 hours. The bread had come from the oven in the 3rd hour, dark on the bottom, the crust cracking the way good bread cracked. She had set it to cool on the rack near the passage door, where the morning air came in, and the smell would travel upward through the house. She did not know whether the smell mattered to anyone above. She sent it anyway. The Kulina, by mid-morning, was no longer the place of quiet darkness it had been at the 4th hour before dawn. The two younger kitchen slaves, a boy of 14 and a woman of 19, who had been assigned to the Kulina 6 months ago, had arrived with the light and were working at the secondary table. The boy was grinding spices, pepper, which had come from somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the world, brought through Alexandria, sold in the market near the Circus Maximus at a price she knew precisely. The woman was straining a preparation of garum through layered cloth, a slow and odorous work that required patience she was still learning. Phoibe moved between them. She corrected, without speaking when she could, with words when she had to, short and specific. The boy's grinding was uneven. She took the mortar from him once, worked it briefly, showed him the motion, returned it. The woman's cloth was folded wrong. She adjusted it without comment. These corrections were not kindness. They were efficiency. A preparation done wrong had to be done again, and doing it again cost time, and time was the substance the day was made of. By midday, she had produced the main meal of the household. This was the meal that mattered most in the Roman domestic rhythm. The largest meal, the one taken in the early afternoon by the family and their guests, the one that demonstrated the household's capacity and care. She had made a lentil preparation with cumin and coriander and a sauce built on garum, reduced slowly until it thickened and the salt deepened into something rounder. She had made eggs baked in a clay vessel with pepper and pine nuts. She had made a preparation of saltfish with oil and herbs. The bread was already done. The olives were dressed. There was a dish of preserved vegetables she had put up herself in the autumn, which had opened into something gentle and sour. She did not taste any of it herself. This was not custom. It was simply the reality of the work. She tasted in preparation, to correct, not to enjoy. By the time a dish was complete, she was already thinking about the next one. The steward came to collect the meal, as he always did, moving through the narrow passage from the main house to the Kulina with the particular expression of a man who had been in proximity to good work for so long that he had stopped noticing it. He looked at the dishes. He said nothing. This was the usual response. The absence of criticism was the closest thing to approval the Kulina received. He carried the dishes upward. She watched the passage after he left. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed the departure of the food. Not empty, but completed, a whole thing having been assembled and removed. The way a season of work feels when the last of it has gone to market. Somewhere above her, people were eating the meal she had made. They would taste it or not. They would notice the pepper or not. They would remark on the sauce, perhaps, or they would simply eat the way people eat things they have never been asked to consider, as fact, as provision, as something that simply was. She thought sometimes of whether the food tasted different to them than it tasted to her, whether what she knew about its making changed what it meant in the mouth. She thought it probably did. She thought. The taste of a thing you had made from darkness through fire was different from the taste of a thing that had simply arrived. But this was the thought of a woman alone in a kitchen, not the thought of the historical record. The preparation water at the work table had gone cold. She changed it, began moving toward the afternoon's work. The morning's cooking was done. She felt it. A familiar diminishment, not rest, not quite pleasure. The weight of completion was its own exhaustion, something accomplished but not celebrated, something given with no ceremony and no witness. She had fed the household. She had done this yesterday. She would do it tomorrow. The meal had left her hands. Strip away the mythology, and what remains is a logistics problem. The city of Rome in the late Republic ran on a supply chain of human bodies. This is not metaphor. It is the most precise description of the economic reality. A skilled kitchen slave in a prosperous Roman household represented a significant purchase. Estimates based on surviving sale records and legal documents suggests that a skilled enslaved cook in the late Republic sold for somewhere between 400 and 2,000 sesterces, depending on training, age, demonstrated ability, and the current price pressure created by recent military campaigns flooding the market. A less skilled assistant might sell for 100 to 200. A specialist, a confectioner, a maker of elaborate sauces, a person who had trained under a celebrated archimagerus could command more. For reference, a common laborer in Rome earned perhaps 3 to 4 sesterces a day. A skilled free craftsperson might earn 6 to 8. The price of a skilled kitchen slave represented years of a free worker's earnings. The investment had to be protected. This is why kitchen slaves were rarely freed. The calculation was explicit in Roman domestic management texts. Columella, Cato, Varro. Agricultural and household management writers of the period discussed the acquisition and maintenance of enslaved workers with the same analytical framework used for livestock and equipment. The questions were initial cost, maintenance cost, productive output, and expected lifespan. The answers shaped decisions about who to buy, how to feed them, how hard to work them, and when, if ever, to consider releasing them. The daily maintenance cost of a kitchen slave was modest. Roman slave rations were calculated, legally and practically, at a minimum sufficient to maintain productive capacity. Grain, some oil, occasionally preserved fish, a modest wine. The kitchen slave who worked in proximity to food was in one sense better positioned than most. She was surrounded by provisions. She did not, for this reason, go hungry in the way that enslaved field workers or mine workers went hungry. But proximity to food is not access to food. The provisions she worked with were not hers. The meals she made were not hers. What she ate was separate, peripheral, the designated allowance of the household's accounting. She produced, in return for this maintenance, meals that served the household's social and political function. In a city like Rome, a prominent household meal was not merely food. It was diplomacy. It was reputation. It was the material expression of the host's wealth, taste, and access to the networks of empire. A dinner party at which the sauce was miscalculated, the spices were wrong, the timing was off. That was a dinner party remembered, gossiped about, carried as a mark against the host into the next engagement. Phoibe's labor underwrote the household's reputation directly. Her skill was the household skill, attributed to the household's stewardship, credited to the household's name. The gap was not small. The gap between what she cost, in food, in maintenance, in the fraction of her purchase price spread across a working year, and what she produced in social and economic value for the household, was the basis of the system. This was not incidental to Roman prosperity. It was the mechanism. The enslaved population of Rome's households produced value far above their maintenance cost, and the excess accumulated in the hands of owners. The owners used that excess for politics, for expansion, for the further purchase of enslaved people whose labor produced further excess. This was the engine. None of this was hidden. Roman writers described it plainly. It was the logic of the household, the logic of the farm, the logic of the mine. The people doing the work were property. Property produced returns. Returns were invested. The system had been self-reinforcing for centuries before Phoibe was born into it. What the accounting did not contain, the knowledge in her hands, the 9 years of maintained starter culture, the adjustments she had learned to make for the quality of the pepper this season versus last season, the way she had calibrated the evening fire for a significant dinner, building it differently than she would for an ordinary meal. The 16 years of accumulated intelligence that had made the household's kitchen function above the level of any kitchen she had ever heard, described in the market gossip of slave quarters. This knowledge had no line in the ledger. It was understood to belong to the household. It had been purchased with her. It would remain with the household when she was too old to work, if she lived that long, which most kitchen slaves did not. The heat and the hours and the particular violence of a decade and a half over fire, taking their arithmetic from the body. Strip away the mythology and what remains is a logistics problem. Solution: human. Cost: human. Neither appears in the record. The respite, when it came, was not rest. She had understood this for years. In the hours after the midday meal was cleared, after the dishes came back through the passage, after the cleaning, after the reordering of the work surfaces, after the soaking of the vessels that needed soaking. There was sometimes an hour, rarely two, an hour in which no immediate command required her movement. She used it to prepare for the evening. This was the answer she would have given if someone had asked. In practical terms, it was true. She took stock of the spices. She checked the age and condition of the garum preparation currently in use against the newer batch in the storage vessel. The newer batch was still too sharp, needed another month. She noted this and put it from her mind. She confirmed the condition of the salt fish brought from the market 3 days ago, found it acceptable. Set the portion she would need to soak in a shallow basin of water to pull out some of the salt before the evening. She prepared, and the preparation was also her way of being alone. The words she would have used, in the language she no longer spoke aloud, would have been something like withdrawn, the drawing in of the self that happens when no one is watching. In Latin, there was no exact equivalent. In Latin, there was only the word for what a person did or did not do. The language had not made room for the state between. She sat, briefly, on the low stool near the passage door. The stone floor held its cold even in the afternoon, when the fire had been burning for hours. The cold came up through the stool's wooden legs and into the backs of her thighs, and she registered it as distant information. The way the body registers things, it has decided not to argue with. The younger woman, whose name was Lyke, came in from the side room where the storage vessels were kept. She had been sent to count the oil. She came back with the count and reported it without looking directly at Phoibe. This was the manner she had learned, the careful formality of the kitchen hierarchy, in which the person at the top was dressed at an angle, like a fire that required approach with attention. Phoibe received the count, said nothing for a moment, then said, "The third vessel is lower than it should be." Lyke went back to check. She came back saying yes, the third vessel, she had miscounted. Phoibe nodded, no further words. This was the manner of their communication. It was not warmth, exactly. It was something colder and more durable. The particular kind of regard that exists between people who share a condition and have no language for what the sharing means. They had not chosen to be in this kulina together. They had not chosen anything. But they were here, and the kitchen required coordination, and coordination over time built a texture that was not friendship, but was not nothing. The boy, whose name was Marcus, a Latin name, given in the household, not a name anyone outside Rome would have given a Greek origin child, was quieter. He was 14. He had been purchased 2 years ago from the market near the Forum. He had, when he first arrived, wept sometimes in the morning when he thought no one was listening. She had not acknowledged the weeping. She had given him tasks that built toward skill progressively. The way she had been taught, or the way she had taught herself she had been taught. This was how knowledge passed in the kulina. Not through explicit instruction, through proximity, repetition, and the slow accumulation of competence. She did not know where he had come from. She had not asked. She had learned long ago that knowing too much about where a person had come from made it harder to watch them stay. The hour was ending. She could feel it, the way she could feel the fire's heat. Not as time measured, but as something the body tracked through accumulated evidence. The position of the light through the passage, the change in the sound of the household above, the sharpening of her own attention that had always preceded, unbidden, the return to full work. She rose from the stool, moved to the work table, began setting out the preparations for the evening. Lyke came to the other end of the table without being asked. The boy appeared in the doorway and saw the two of them beginning and took his place, without instruction. The kitchen was itself again. The hour between had closed behind them like water. The guest arrived with evening. She heard it from the kulina, not the specific voice, but the change in the house's acoustics that always accompanied a significant arrival. The door opened differently. Footsteps above were more deliberate. The household shifted from domestic to performative, the way bodies shift when they are being observed. And the shift traveled through the walls and floors, the way heat travels through stone. She had been building toward this for 2 hours. The fire was different tonight. She had fed it differently in the afternoon, banking it in layers so that by the third hour of preparation, it had reached the sustained heat she needed. Not the variable cooking fire of ordinary meals, but something steadier, more committed. A fire that would not fluctuate while she needed it not to fluctuate. The menu had been decided 3 days ago, adjusted yesterday, finalized this morning in her mind. The guest was a man of some consequence in the city. She knew this from the way the steward had mentioned him, not with specific information, which was not given to kitchen slaves, but with the particular quality of understatement that men of the steward's type used when they were more impressed than they wanted to appear. She was making a preparation of pork with a sauce of garum, wine reduced to half its volume, cumin ground fine, and fresh coriander. Simple in its principles, but demanding in its execution. The kind of preparation that revealed immediately if any step had been done without care. She was making a lentil dish dressed with oil and herbs and a small quantity of the pepper she had saved from the best of the recent supply. She was making a preparation of eggs beaten smooth with garum and cooked low over the coals in a clay vessel until they had just set. A preparation she had seen once years ago and had reconstructed from memory and from the logic of heat. There were also olives, preserved figs, a honey preparation for the end of the meal. She moved between fire and work table. The kulina was loud, the spit and hiss of fat reaching the coals, the bubble of the wine reduction, the thud of the pestle where like worked the spices, the low percussion of clay vessels moving on stone. Inside all of this sound, she was tracking 7 things simultaneously. The reduction's color and smell, the pork's internal heat by the way the flesh responded to the back of a spoon, the eggs' slow setting, the lentils' texture, the olive oil heating for the dressing, the fire's consistency, the time. The tracking was not effortful. It was automatic, the way breathing is automatic. The body doing its accumulated work while the mind moved through it, like water through a channel made over years. She burned her right hand. Not badly. A line across the heel of the palm, where she had reached over the rim of the fire vessel, a fraction too far, misjudging by some small amount. Perhaps she had been watching the reduction and not the reach. The burn was immediate. The white instant of contact, then the rush of sensation, then the settling into a specific narrow pain. She did not stop moving. She wrapped the hand briefly in the wet cloth she kept near the fire for exactly this purpose. Continued with the other hand, the seconds the wrap required. Then unwrapped and continued with both hands. This too was something learned through repetition. That stopping for pain was not a luxury the work allowed. That the body could be managed around its damage in the short term, and the long term was its own separate accounting. The reduction was right. She pulled it from the fire, added the garum in the careful measure. Garum was salt as well as flavor, and adding it wrong meant the whole preparation required rebuilding, which there was no time for now. The smell changed. It was correct. Like looked up from the secondary table. Said nothing. But she was watching, and the watching meant she knew it was correct. The boy was tending the eggs. She watched him for 5 seconds without speaking. He had the heat right. She looked away. The pork was done. She knew this before she tested it. She had felt the change in it through the spoon during the past quarter hour. The specific relaxation of the flesh that happens when it has given up its resistance to heat. She tested anyway. It was correct. The meal went up through the passage in 3 movements. Each time the steward returned for the next course, she watched his face. It gave nothing. The absence of urgency was its own signal, a small satisfaction. Quiet, sustained, not spoken. The dinner was good. She knew it. No one would tell her. History didn't happen the way they taught you. It happened in silence, in rooms no one remembers, by hands no one wrote about. 50 BC, Rome. The smell of wood ash and cold stone at the 4th hour before sunrise. She rose before the city did. That was the arrangement. Had been the arrangement for centuries before her birth. Would be the arrangement for centuries after her death. The Atrium Vestae held its breath in darkness. The garden invisible beyond the corridor. The marble floors carrying the night's chill up through the soles of her feet, with the particular insistence of stone that has been cold for hours. She did not pause at the sensation. She had walked this corridor for 8 years. Her feet knew the cold, the way her hands knew the smell of ash. The Temple of Vesta was not large. That surprised people, the ones who saw it for the first time. Pilgrims from the provinces, magistrates newly arrived in Rome, men who had imagined something grander. It was circular, small, and in its smallness it concentrated everything. She passed through the entrance carrying a long-handled implement of bronze and felt the heat before she crossed the threshold. The flame was low, not dangerously low, not the kind of low that brought consequences, but low enough that it required attention, low enough that it had been waiting for her. She had learned, in her first year, that fire was not a thing one simply maintained. Fire was a relationship. It asked for specific things, specific wood placed at specific angles, in specific quantities, and it rewarded precision, not with warmth alone, but with a quality of light that distinguished living flame from all other light sources. The flame in this temple was not metaphorically eternal. It was practically, continuously fed. That was what eternity meant in practice. Not magic, not miracle. Attention. Before dawn every morning for 30 years, she placed the wood. She adjusted the angle. She watched. The smoke rose in the particular way it rose when the wood was dry. Cleanly, without the gray heaviness of damp material. And the smell was the smell of her entire adult life. Wood ash and incense and the faint undertone of the stone itself, heated and cooled so many thousands of times that it had absorbed the ritual into its surface. She breathed it without thinking about breathing it. Her hands moved without requiring direction from her thoughts. Outside, the forum was quiet in the way it was never quite quiet during daylight. Still present, still audible at the edges. The occasional voice of a night watchman or the sound of a cart permitted entry before dawn, but stripped of its daytime density. She could hear the city existing without performing itself. She had stood in this place on enough mornings to know that distinction. The flame steadied. She watched it settle into its full height, the color moving through its familiar gradations from the deep orange at the base to the pale luminescence at the tip. And she understood, as she had understood since her 3rd year of service, that what she was watching was not symbolic of Rome's survival. It was not symbolic of anything. The Romans had decided it was Rome's survival. That was a different thing entirely. The flame was a flame. The meaning had been added by consensus, maintained by tradition, and enforced by the authority of everyone who had agreed to agree. She did not think this as a cynicism. She thought it as a fact. She had grown up inside the institution. She understood the distinction between the thing and the meaning assigned to the thing. And she understood that both were real, and that understanding both simultaneously was part of what she had become. Her feet were cold. 8 years of cold mornings. 8 years of this exact floor, this exact chill, this exact quality of dark before dawn broke over the Palatine and sent its first light down into the forum. She shifted her weight without stepping back from the flame. A woman tended the fire. The city slept. The agreement between them was not spoken and had never needed to be spoken. She was the keeper of the thing the city had decided was sacred, and the city, in exchange, had given her a specific and unusual life. A life that was neither free nor imprisoned, neither ordinary nor divine. A life that was precisely itself, in the way that very few lives were permitted to be precisely themselves. She watched the flame. It burned steadily. She would return before nightfall. She would return the morning after that. She had 22 more years of returns ahead of her, and the stone floor was cold, and the flame was bright, and outside the city was beginning, very slowly, to remember that it was alive. Remove the story, and what you have is a calculation. The calculation was correct. Rome in 50 BC was a city of approximately 1 million people, governed by institutions that were, depending on the year, either functioning or failing. The Senate deliberated, the courts produced verdicts, the legions moved, and at the center of the forum, 6 women of specified age, selected by specified criteria, maintained a specified fire according to a specified schedule. Everything about the Vestal institution was specified. This was not incidental to its purpose. This was its purpose. The Romans needed religion to be credible. For religion to be credible, it required bodies. Actual human bodies, committed to visible acts of maintenance, subject to visible consequences for failure. A flame maintained by no one was a flame maintained by magic. A flame maintained by 6 identified women, whose selection was public, whose service was documented, whose punishment for failure was administered by a named official. That was a flame maintained by the state. The distinction mattered. One could be doubted, the other could be audited. She had entered service at 14. She had not chosen it. The Pontifex Maximus had selected her, had spoken the words of the ancient formula, had taken her by the hand, had separated her from her father's legal authority in a single ritual act. That transferred her, in the technical language of Roman law, from the potestas of her father to the authority of the state. Her father had not protested. No father did. The honor was real. The legal exchange was permanent. And the girl, whatever she had wanted at 13, became something else at 14. She had wanted, at 13, things she no longer remembered clearly. The wanting had worn smooth over 8 years. Not disappeared, but transformed. The way a stone worn by water does not lose its substance, but loses its sharp edges. She was 22. She had been many things since 14, and she had learned to measure the distance between them with a certain detachment that was not coldness and was not peace, but was something that lived between the two. The institution was neither cruel nor kind. It was precise. 6 Vestals at all times, no more, no fewer. Because 6 was the number that permitted continuous coverage of duty while allowing for illness, festival obligations, and the specific requirements of the religious calendar. Vestals were selected between the ages of 6 and 10 because that age permitted sufficient training before the duties became consequential. 30 years of service, because 30 years covered the full span of a Roman woman's reproductive life, which was the span the institution required to render a woman's domestic status legible to the state. None of this was cruel. None of it was kind. It was architecture. It was planning. She ground the spelt flour some mornings and felt the grain's resistance in her palms and thought about nothing in particular. She participated in the festivals, wore the correct garments, spoke the correct words, stood in the correct positions. Rome performed its public religion. The public watched. The watching confirmed the performing. The performing confirmed the belief. The belief confirmed the state. The state confirmed her position. Her position confirmed the watching. The circle was complete. She was inside the circle. She had been inside it since she was 14, and she would be inside it until she was 44. And the circle did not require her to feel anything about being inside it. And yet, the flame was real. The ash smell was real. The cold marble at the 4th hour before sunrise was real. And the weight of the bronze implement in her hands was real. And the quality of the light, when the fire steadied after tending, was a real quality that existed nowhere else in Rome. The institution had built a container around a set of actual physical practices, and the practices had their own reality, independent of the meaning assigned to them. She had known this since her 3rd year. She knew it with the specific certainty of a person who performs the same action 10,000 times and arrives, eventually, at the action itself, stripped of all the words anyone has ever placed around it. 30 years, 6 women, 1 flame. The accounting was simple. The arrangement was ancient. The women inside the arrangement were as complicated as any women anywhere in Rome, with preferences and politics and the particular tedium of institutional life, and the particular strange power of being respected rather than loved, honored rather than known. They existed inside the symbol without being reducible to the symbol. This distinction the historians mostly failed to make. Remove the story, and what you have is a calculation. The calculation was correct. Every civilization that lasted long enough made some version of it. The mola salsa was made on 3 specified days of the year, and also whenever Rome required it, which was more often than the specified days suggested. She had been assigned to preparation that morning. The designation rotated among the 6 Vestals according to a schedule maintained by the eldest, who had been in service for 26 years and administered the internal calendar of the Atrium Vestae with the same expression she applied to everything. A steady, unreadable attention that had stopped communicating preferences sometime in the 2nd decade of service. She handed the assignment without commentary. She received no commentary in return. The preparation room was off the north corridor of the Atrium Vestae, away from the garden, where the light came in low and the smell of the kitchen staff's morning work drifted through the connecting passage. She set out the implements, the grinding stones, the specific bowl of unglazed ceramic that was kept only for this purpose, the salt brought from the specified salt works, and began. The spelt flour first. The stones were heavy, and the motion required both arms and a particular angle of the body, a stance she had found naturally in her 2nd year and had not altered since. The grain gave way in stages. The smell was dry and faintly bitter, the smell of something raw being reduced to its essential form. The salt was coarser than table salt, brought in from the coastal flats, processed according to instructions that predated the current republic by several generations. She added it in the specified ratio. The ratio was written in a document she had memorized in her 1st year and no longer needed to consult, and began the 2nd grinding, which was slower and required more attention because the mixture's consistency was the criterion by which the product was judged. Too coarse, and it would not adhere to the sacrificial animal correctly. Too fine, and the texture departed from tradition, which was itself a form of error. This was the work, the actual, unremarkable work that Roman religion required at its foundation. Women grinding grain in a room off a corridor, checking consistency with their fingers, adjusting, repeating until the product met specification. The priests handled the public ceremonies. The Vestals handled the material preparation that made them possible. The distinction between these roles was liturgical. In practice, the mola salsa that was scattered across the forehead of every sacrificial animal in Rome's public rites came from this room, from these stones, from these hands. She thought, as she worked, about the shipment of spelt that had arrived that week. The supply was the responsibility of the state. The Vestals did not purchase their own materials, did not manage their own budgets at that level, were provided for by a system of allocations administered through the priestly colleges. But the quality varied. She had mentioned it to the eldest after the previous shipment, and the eldest had noted it, and presumably a note had gone somewhere because the current shipment was better. This was the bureaucracy. This was the mechanism by which the eternal survived. Someone noticed the quality of the grain. Someone wrote it down. Someone corrected the allocation. The flame burned because the wood was dry. The mola salsa worked because the grain was right. Now outside the room, Rome was becoming itself. The forum filling with men conducting business, the courts opening, the markets assembling their stalls along the familiar paths, the particular noise of a city of 1 million people, all deciding simultaneously to be awake. She could not see the forum from the preparation room, but she had lived adjacent to its sound for 8 years and could read it with reasonable accuracy. A normal morning, no riots, no extraordinary events, the sound of ordinary urban density. She worked for 2 hours. The mola salsa, when finished, had the correct texture, slightly gritty, the salt not quite dissolved into the flour, but distributed through it with adequate evenness. She transferred it to the storage container. With the practiced economy of someone who has performed an action so many times that the action has become its own kind of knowledge, stored not in memory but in the body itself. The preparation room was cold, in the way rooms adjacent to corridors were cold. A conducted chill rather than an outdoor cold, arriving through stone rather than air. Her hands were tired in the specific way that grinding produced. The small muscles of the forearms, the base of each thumb. She set the implements aside. The sacred had a texture, a weight. It arrived in the body as fatigue, as flour dust on the front of the white wool dress, as the smell of salt and grain that would remain in her hair until the afternoon. She carried it to storage. The morning's work was done. The man's name was Demetrios, and he had been a household slave of the Atrium Vestae for 11 years, and that morning he knelt in the garden and waited. The legal mechanism was ancient and precise. A Vestal Virgin could free a slave encountered by chance on the road. The mechanism was contact, the touch of her hand. This was the formula, as it had existed for generations, encountered by chance on the road, the touch effecting liberation in that moment. Without documentation, without process, without the intermediary of courts or masters, or the elaborate manumission procedures that attended the formal freeing of a slave. It was one of the most extraordinary legal powers possessed by any person in Rome. It had been given to the Vestals as part of the architecture of their sacred status, a power so absolute that it bypassed the entire machinery of property law by virtue of a single physical contact. In practice, the encounters were rarely accidental. Demetrios had served faithfully. He had requested, through the eldest, that the matter be considered. The eldest had brought it to the group, because such decisions were not made by individual Vestals acting in isolation. The legal power was individual, but the institutional consequences were shared, and the Atrium Vestae was an institution. There had been a period of consideration. The consideration had concluded in his favor, and so that morning, a route had been established. She would walk to the temple for the midday tending, and she would pass through the garden corridor, and Demetrios would be present, and the encounter would be witnessed by 2 of the household staff. She walked the corridor. The garden was visible through the columns, the laurel and bay heavy with the smell of resin in the morning warmth, the light coming down at the angle it came in spring, the fountain making the sound it always made. A sound so continuous she heard it only when she specifically attended to it. Demetrios was kneeling by the garden path, his head bowed, his position that of a man who understood precisely what was happening and had prepared himself for it across many days. She saw him. She walked toward him. The touch was a hand placed on the crown of his head. She felt the texture of his hair, the warmth of a living person, the slight tension of someone holding very still. The law required only the contact. The contact lasted 3 seconds. The witnesses observed it. She continued walking toward the temple. Behind her, a man who had been property was not property. She had held this power since she was 14. She had used it 4 times across 8 years. Each time, the mechanism was the same. The deliberation, the route, the garden, the touch, the continuation. Each time, the legal transformation happened in the moment of contact, and each time, She walked forward afterward, feeling the weight of what had just changed without having visibly changed anything. A man was free. The garden still smelled of laurel. The fountain still made its sound. The law had moved, invisibly, through her body. The Romans had embedded certain extraordinary capacities in the Vestal institution deliberately, not because they believed Vestals were superhuman, but because they needed certain functions to be above ordinary legal process. The power to free by touch bypassed property law. The power to alter wills was the power to redirect inheritance outside the normal patrilineal structures. The word of a Vestal, as testimony without oath, meant the state had designated a category of witness whose credibility was presumed rather than argued. Each power was strange. Each power was useful. Each power rested on the institution's continued credibility, which rested on the continued maintenance of the flame, which rested on the continued getting up before dawn of 6 women who had been selected between the ages of 6 and 10. The afternoon's document work was less dramatic. A property transfer required witnessing. She sat in the room set aside for legal functions and observed the parties and confirmed the transaction with her mark and said the words that made the words legally binding. The parties thanked her with the particular formality they always employed. Not warmth exactly, not even respect exactly, but something adjacent to both. She acknowledged it and returned to her rooms. Power moved differently through women in Rome than it moved through men. Men wielded it visibly, noisily, in the forum and the courts and the Senate House. She wielded it through proximity and contact and the witnessed declaration. Through being present, specifically, in places where her specific presence carried specific weight. She had no vote. She could not hold office. She could alter the distribution of a man's estate and free a slave with her hand, and her word could end a legal dispute. She carried contradictions with the same steadiness she carried everything else. The version that survived is not the version that happened. What survived was the symbol, the pure flame and the pure woman, her white wool impeccable, her expression serene, standing between Rome and catastrophe by the virtue of her discipline. This version had a clarity that recommended itself to the sculptors who made her in marble, and the poets who placed her in verse, and the later centuries that found in her an image clean enough to use. She became a type rather than a person, the type of the dedicated, the type of the consecrated, the type of the woman who had chosen the higher calling. She had not chosen. She had been chosen at 6, before she could form a preference that extended past the next meal. Her parents had not refused. Her father had been honored by the selection, which meant he gained social capital from the permanent transfer of his daughter to the legal authority of the state, which meant he had sold her to the institution, while the transaction was still described as a gift. She did not hold this against him. It was the arrangement. Everyone participated in the arrangement and called sacred. And the calling it sacred was part of the arrangement. What had the 30 years taken specifically? A husband. The domestic relationship, the specific negotiation of 2 people sharing a household with their preferences and their conflicts and their ordinary, sustained intimacy. She had not had this. She would not have it until 44, if she chose it then, and most did not choose it then, because the legal position of an unmarried Vestal after service was higher than the legal position of any married woman in Rome. Marriage meant re-entering the patria potestas of a husband. The former Vestal could hold her own property, manage her own affairs, give legal testimony, exist as a juridical in her own right. Wives could not do these things. Wives had a husband between them and the law, always. So the 30 years took the husband and gave back the legal selfhood that marriage would have removed. This was the trade. It was not nothing. Children, she would not bear children. This was the loss she felt most specifically, not with anguish, but with a steady, occasional awareness, the way one becomes aware of a sound only in its absence. She had watched the household slaves with their children in the garden, watched the particular posture of a woman holding a small body, the specific quality of that attention, and felt the awareness without dramatizing it. She was 22. The feeling was real. It was also bounded by the fact that she had not had the life that would have produced the children and could not therefore grieve what had not been taken, exactly because it had never been present to take. The ordinary life of a Roman woman of her class involved a specific sequence: marriage arranged in adolescence, a household to manage, a husband's political career to support from within the domestic structure, children to raise and position, the work of maintaining alliances through hospitality and relationship. She had none of this. She had instead a luxurious residence, a staff, a schedule, legal powers that no married woman possessed, a social position that placed her above senators' wives at public events, and 30 years of a life that was entirely unlike the one the culture around her recognized as a woman's life. She had learned the festivals in her first year, the flame duties in her first month, the mola, salsa preparation in her second year, the legal protocols across her third and fourth years. By the fifth year, she knew everything the role required. For the next 25 years, she would apply what she knew. This was the specific shape of the time, not a decade of learning followed by a decade of mastery, but an early mastery followed by an extraordinarily long application of that mastery to a mostly unchanging set of duties. The sameness was the condition. The sameness was what the institution required. The historians who wrote about the Vestals wrote about the dramatic ones, the ones accused of unchastity, the ones who died, the ones who intervened in famous trials, the undramatic ones, the ones who served their 30 years in their entirety without accusation or crisis, who tended the flame and ground the grain and witnessed the documents and walked the garden and turned 44 in the Atrium Vestae and left quietly. Those women mostly did not survive in the record. She was going to be one of those women. She knew it. She had known it for years. The version that survived is not the version that happened. The version that happened was stranger, smaller, and more human than the one in the history books. The forum was visible from the east rooms of the Atrium Vestae in the afternoon, when the light came at the right angle and the columns of the Temple of Saturn did not block the sightline entirely. She had stood at this window on 1,000 afternoons. She had watched the forum the way a person watches weather, without intent, without particular focus, reading the state of things from pattern and movement and the quality of sound that accompanied each configuration of people below. A political assembly had a particular density, a particular noise distribution, a concentration of toegate men in the central area, and a peripheral crowd that moved differently than the crowd moved on ordinary market days. A religious procession moved slowly and created temporary stillness in everything around it. An ordinary afternoon in early spring produced the moderate, uncoordinated motion of commerce and business and purposeless circulation, people moving at their own speeds, in their own directions, the aggregate producing a texture rather than a pattern. She was 22 and had watched this forum for 8 years, and would watch it for 22 more years. And she occupied a position relative to it that had no equivalent among the million people below. She participated in the forum differently than any of them did. She had front row seats at the gladiatorial events and the public spectacles, seated above the ordinary public, below the senior magistrates, in a position that marked her visibility as itself a form of participation. She attended the major festivals as a principal rather than an observer. Her passage through the forum on ceremonial days cleared traffic. Lictors went before her. The crowd stepped back, the same crowd that had been conducting its business an instant before. She moved through the public city as something the city had designated as set apart, and yet she could not speak in the Senate. She could not stand for office. She could not own a business in her own right, could not build a client network in the way that male members of the aristocracy built client networks. Through favors given and obligations incurred, through the sustained management of mutual dependency, her power was juridical and symbolic. It operated in specific registers. Outside those registers, she was a woman, which meant she moved through the city differently than men moved through it, in a culture that organized almost every public space around the assumption of male presence. The man below was arguing with a vendor. She could see the arm gesture, but not hear the words. The forum's ambient sound was too general, too continuous, to isolate individual voices from this distance. The argument resolved in the way arguments at market stalls usually resolve. One party conceded or departed, the transaction either occurring or not occurring. The next customer arriving. The city was a system for producing resolutions. It generated conflicts and resolutions in roughly equal proportions and moved forward on the surplus. She had been watching it for 8 years and would watch it for 22 more. The forum she watched at 44 would not be the forum she watched now. Buildings changed, configurations shifted. The slow accretion of the city's physical record would have altered the sightlines from this window by the time her service ended. She would watch the changes happen over time from this room, in this position. This was the temporal texture of the Vestal life, not the dramatic moment, but the long view. The changes that were only visible across decades. Rome was the largest city in the world. She had never been outside it, not since her selection. She had been in Rome for all 22 years of her remembered life, specifically in this compound, adjacent to this forum, in rooms that had held Vestals for generations before her and would hold Vestals for generations after. She knew the city with a particular, intimate, limited knowledge. The forum in all its states, the garden of the Atrium Vestae in all its seasons, the Temple of Vesta in all qualities of light. Outside this geography, Rome was mostly sound and report. The sun moved. The forum's afternoon light shifted from the direct warmth of midday to the longer, slower illumination of late afternoon. The light that made the travertine glow in its particular way. The light she had watched thousands of times, moving across the stone in the same progression it always made. She was tired in the way that the middle of a long day produces tiredness. Not the sharp exhaustion of physical labor, but the accumulated weight of sustained attention, of presence maintained across many hours. She remained at the window a few minutes more. The city continued to be the city. She continued to watch it. Below, no one looked up. The flame at dusk was different from the flame before dawn. She had understood this since her first year. Understood it not as metaphor, but as physical fact. A flame that had burned continuously through a full day carried something in its quality that freshly built fire did not carry. The wood structure had shifted and settled. The ash base had accumulated in its particular configuration. The specific combination of air movement and stone heat, and the small variations in the wood supply across the hours, had produced a flame that was, by dusk, shaped by its own history. It did not look the same as it had looked at dawn. She could identify the difference without being able to fully articulate it. This was the knowledge that lived in the body rather than in language. She entered the temple as the light outside moved through its last orange graduation before the onset of dark. The forum was winding down, the vendors pulling their stalls. The evening traffic acquiring its different character, the quality of sound shifting from the density of commerce to the sparser, more purposeful noise of people moving toward wherever they would spend the night. Below the forum's activities, Rome was arranging itself for darkness with the efficiency of a city that had practiced the transition every evening for several centuries. Inside the temple, the flame occupied its full height. She had tended it at midday. It was well. She added wood not because it required wood, but because the evening tending included the addition of wood. The routine itself was the maintenance, the consistency of attention more important than the specific necessity of any individual action. She understood this. She had understood it for years. The routine was a form of insurance against the moment of genuine necessity. If you tended the flame every time, regardless of apparent need, you would not miss the moment when it genuinely needed tending. She had been 14 when she first understood what it meant to be responsible for something a city had decided was sacred. Not symbolically responsible, actually responsible in the sense that her specific actions would have specific consequences, and the consequences extended beyond herself to everything the institution touched. If the flame went out, the Pontifex Maximus would administer the punishment personally. Not because the flame going out was the worst thing that could happen to Rome. It was not. And everyone who thought carefully about the matter knew it was not. But because the institutional credibility of the Vestal Order required that the consequences be real and visible, the punishment made the responsibility legible. The legibility of the responsibility maintained the credibility of the sacred. She had never let it go out. She was not certain she deserved particular credit for this. She was constitutionally careful, had been careful since childhood, had been selected partly because the Pontifex Maximus or his agents had seen in her, at the age of 6 or 7, the kind of temperament that sustained attention rather than requiring it. But there was also the ordinary fact of human fallibility. Illness, distraction, the accumulated mistakes of long years. She had been fortunate, in 8 years, to have not been ill at the wrong moment, to have had the other 5 Vestals available as a system that distributed the risk across multiple people. 6 women. The redundancy was designed. If 1 was ill, 5 remained. If 2 were ill, 4 remained. The institution was built against single points of failure in the way that important institutions were built, with the recognition that individual humans could not be relied upon absolutely. And so the structure itself had to carry the reliability that no individual could guarantee. She was a component of a redundant system. This was not diminishing. This was the architecture of something meant to last. What did it mean to keep something sacred? She had thought about this for years without arriving at a final answer. And she had come, eventually, to understand that not arriving at a final answer was itself an answer. The sacred was not a property of the thing, but a property of the sustained attention directed toward it. Rome had directed its sustained attention toward this flame for long enough that the flame had become the container for everything Rome wished to believe about itself. Its permanence, its order, its continuity across the uncertainty of any given year. The container was real. The fire inside it was real. The meaning was added by the people looking at both. She added wood. The flame rose slightly, then settled. The quality of the light inside the temple changed for a moment and returned to what it had been. She stayed until dark fell completely. She watched the flame become the only light in the room. She had done this 8 years. She would do it 22 more. The flame burned at the 4th hour past sunset with the full, steady quality that required nothing. She was 22 years old and had been 22 for a season now. Had entered the age without ceremony as birthdays passed inside the Atrium Vestae, noted in the internal calendar maintained by the eldest, and acknowledged by the small domestic gestures the Volkshaushof offered on such occasions. The day had passed. She was 22. She would be 23, and then 24. And the years would accumulate in a way. Years accumulated inside a life that had a known shape. Not arbitrarily, not subject to the reversals and redirections that attended ordinary Roman lives, but along a path whose terminus was specified. She would be 44. She had always known she would be 44 at the end. The garden was dark and cold in the way spring nights were cold, the cold that arrived only after sunset. The daytime warmth having been a conditional warmth, present by permission of the sun and withdrawn at dark. She could smell the laurel. The fountain sound was present at the edge of perception, continuous and unassertive. The way background sounds become when they have been present long enough to cease requiring attention. She had stopped hearing it separately years ago. It was part of the silence now. She had become, in 8 years, something that no other woman in Rome was. Not better. She had grown past that kind of comparison, which required a ranking she no longer believed was the appropriate framework. Simply different. She knew the temple at every hour. She knew the flame in every condition. She knew the physical and legal geography of an institution that had existed longer than the Republic itself. It traced its origins back to the earliest versions of the Roman story, to the kings, to the founding, to whatever set of arrangements the first Romans had made with the forces they were not able to otherwise manage. She was part of that continuity, not the whole of it. One component in her specific years carrying her specific part of the transmission. 22 more years. She did not experience the number as weight. She had been working towards something like equanimity about it since the 6th or 7th year of service, when the initial adaptation to the life had fully completed and the reality of the long middle had become apparent. The life would be long. The duties would be largely the same across the length. The fame or historical record that the dramatic Vestals achieved was not her path. She would tend the flame and prepare the mola salsa and witness the documents and walk through the forum on ceremonial days and clear traffic by her presence and exercise her legal powers carefully and watch the forum from the east window on afternoons and grow old incrementally inside the most luxurious residence in Rome. What had she become? Not a symbol. Symbols were flat, and she was not flat. She had preferences about the grain supply and opinions about the religious calendar, and she remembered things from her childhood with a clarity that sometimes surprised her. The smell of her father's house, the quality of light in a room she had not entered since she was 6. She carried these alongside the ash smell and the cold marble and the weight of the bronze implement. 8 years of one kind of life, 6 years of another before that, 22 more ahead of her. There were 5 other women in the Atrium Vestae. She knew each of them with the specific intimacy of people who live in enforced proximity across years. Not friendship exactly, not family exactly, but something that had its own name in the experience of institutions. The relationship between people who share a structure, whose lives are shaped by the same rules, whose fates are partially intertwined. She trusted the eldest the way one trusted long experience. She felt the specific ease of comfort with the one closest to her own years in service. She maintained the correct distances with this youngest, who had arrived recently and was still in the first difficult adaptation. Rome slept below the forum. The flame burned in the temple. She was in the garden in the middle of the night, standing in the cold. The same sensation against the back of her neck it had always been, at this hour, for 8 years. The body does not require things to be significant in order to record them. It records the cold, and the laurel smell, and the sound of the fountain, and the quality of dark. And it carries the record forward, year after year, until the years are all the record there is. The flame burned steadily in the empty temple. She breathed. 22 more years, and whatever came after.